Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to contribute to this debate. Members on this side of the House fully understand that repealing the Identity Cards Act of 2006 and indeed scrapping ID cards was a manifesto pledge for both the Conservative Party and for the Liberal Democrat Party, and we're fulfilling a pledge to the electorate on this issue. In fact, Mr Speaker, I think it's one of the few actions taken by the government which can claim at least some sort of mandate from the public. Although I would add that Labour was elected in 2005 with a manifesto pledge that stated, and I quote, "We will introduce ID cards, including biometric data like fingerprints, backed up by a national register, and rolling out initially on a voluntary basis as people renew their passports." So, there was a manifesto basis on which the decisions were made, if that is part of the argument against. The present government have taken the scheme in its infancy and killed it off before it's even had a chance to prove itself in terms of finance, security, issues of identity theft protection have already been raised, and indeed popularity, and any other measure of its worth. As we learned during the committee stage, the argument was made by government, and their reasons for revoking ID cards are, in my view, weak, mean and, most importantly, costly to the taxpayer. Indeed, in committee on the 1st of July, the Minister stated that his commitment to abolish the identity card scheme was, because, and I quote, "It was and, until the bill is enacted, an expensive and misguided scheme." I would contend that assertion is completely wrong and in itself a misguided statement. The ID card scheme would become most most expensive in terms of cost as soon as this bill is enacted, because the expenditure has actually already been incurred in setting up the scheme in terms of the infrastructure, the computer software and so on. And the recovery of the money actually relies upon allowing the ID scheme to continue, and members opposite should remember that expenditure was incurred subsequent to a manifesto commitment from the previous Labour government. I don't want to dwell on the motives behind this bill. I suspect they're completely different for members of the Liberal Democrat and Conservative supporters, but it's clear that Conservative members of the coalition based their opposition to the ID cards proposals on a false premise. I'll give way.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman give way. I can assure him that the letters that I receive in my constituency are asking me to scrap this ID bill as quickly as possible, purely on the grounds of civil liberties, and it is an absolute astonishment to me that there can be any debate about this for any much longer. In fact, a number of people have suggested that perhaps we ought to wind up right now, but obviously there's a lot of people here who want to carry on talking about this, but I have not had a single letter asking me to carry this on.
The Honourable Lady is going far wide of what we're discussing at the moment. Grahame Morris.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think I don't think the arguments have been made effectively. There are aspects to the bill that deserve to be, to the scheme that deserve to be retained, and they're embodied in the amendments. I wanted to focus on new clause 2 of the bill, which states that all ID cards that are valid immediately before that date are to be treated as cancelled by the Secretary of State at the end of a period of 1 month beginning that day. In committee, the Minister proudly stated that this was his government's first bill. I find it personally astonishing that he can be pleased with himself, as really this first act of the new government is an act to break a contract established between citizen and state. As my honourable friend, the member for Burton West, has already mentioned, those people put their faith in government and bought an ID card, entered into it on a voluntary basis. There was no issue of compulsion in it. I believe they've been sorely and spitefully let down by the bill and by the government. Their behaviour is illogical, unfair and frankly unnecessary. And for whatever reason, people decided to invest in an ID card, and honourable members have made various suggestions, whether it was to protect their identity, and that was a major concern. And identity theft is a huge issue that costs the economy billions of pounds and individuals untold stress and suffering, or simply as a more versatile method of identification. And again, members on this side have given some excellent examples. Or perhaps even as a proof of age. Whatever their reason, they did enter into a contract, and that contract should be honoured. Instead, this contract is now being torn up by the coalition government, and those people who acted in good faith can justifiably feel let down. We've heard arguments from members opposite that it may have been reasonable for people to expect that should the Tories win power, ID cards would be scrapped. Well, indeed, that's true for the Lib Dems, as it was in their manifesto. But should we really be sending a message to the public that they shouldn't take too much notice of what the government says, because the next government might say something different? I think that's a really dangerous message to send out. Gladly.
And I know he's already a very assiduous constituency member of Parliament, but I remember prior to the last election, my constituents came to me and asked me about ID cards. And my advice to them was very clear. Do not take one out. Do not take an ID card out. They're too controversial and it might be rescinded. What would he have said in that situation if a constituent had come to him asking his advice about taking an ID card, given they're so contentious?
I think it's dangerous territory to get into. It's an area that we explored earlier and in committee. If you were going to apply that same principle, if you're going to apply that same principle in relation to what a government may do, what about nationalisation without compensation? Is that the same principle that's being applied? But I'd like to move on a little. Well, you know, if that's the logic of the argument, the decision to terminate existing and operational ID cards 1 month after this bill receives royal assent, assuming it receives royal assent today, without any compensation for those who've purchased a card, is not only a shame, it's a travesty. I mentioned that Labour had made a manifesto pledge to the public. The public had returned Labour to government in 2005, and we implemented a scheme where a citizen could, for a £30 fee, receive a card, and this card would have a given expiry date, 10 years. For the current government to enter into office and turn this system on its head without consideration for those people who'd participated in the scheme on a voluntary basis, those people who'd handed over their money in good faith, seems to me to be a complete dereliction of duty. And it does set a dangerous precedent for the future. I'll give way to the member for Hexham.
I'm grateful, but you talk about the exact dereliction of duty. This is a billions of pounds scheme for barely 12,000 people that was trotted out in circumstances where there is no prospect of it being taken up.
Well, in response to that specific point, this is in its infancy, and the scheme was essentially only marketed in 2 areas, as far as I could tell, in Manchester and London. The scheme would have rolled out and presumably had a much greater appeal. And I think there is an interesting contradiction between what's happened with the big corporate interests who are involved in the scheme in terms of the compensation that was paid to them and the failure to make any kind of recompense to ordinary citizens who paid £30 for a card. The sum of £30 mentioned by my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle North, it may seem a trifling sum to some members of this House, but for a great many people, including many who I represent, it's a considerable amount of money. There's been some debate on whether and why individuals on low incomes would choose to spend such a sum on an ID card. But we have to consider that alternative forms of identification are more expensive. For example, a provisional driving licence, which is an accepted form of ID commonly used by younger people for proof of age, costs £50. So there is a cost reason that would drive people voluntarily to choose the ID proof of the ID card. I would like to suggest to the House, therefore, that people on lower incomes needing to prove their age would naturally be inclined to opt for an ID card. Whether the person who bought a card is on a low income or a millionaire is really an irrelevance in many respects, because the behaviour of this government, by not addressing this unfairness, the injustice contained within the bill, is deplorable. Mr Deputy Speaker, I can't see personally why these cards that have already been issued cannot in some way remain valid until their expiry date. The coalition government has only a handful of policies on which they truly agree, and I do accept that not continuing with ID cards is amongst them. But I would contend that not enough care has been given to either reimbursing cardholders or indeed making some attempt to maintain currently already issued cards, perhaps with some reduced functionality, has been given. There remains a database for passports, and this card could perhaps, at least in some way, remain an authenticated identification document. I wonder whether the Minister would inform the House whether he'd sought any advice on possible functions for the already issued cards, or whether he was content just to allow them to fall. To my mind, Mr Deputy Speaker, the cards, there is no reason why the cards couldn't remain valid until the expiry date. And just to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Government is abandoning ID cards without any concern for the expenditure that has already been incurred by the taxpayers, without any consideration for current ID card holders, and with little thought for the future of British passport security and the use of biometric data. The Minister has had every opportunity to address the issues that my honourable friends and I on this side of the House have raised in committee, and it's a shame that he was unable to work with us to at least try and improve some aspects of this bill.